April 12, 1945. Weimar, Germany. Late afternoon. The air tasted of ash and rain. Along the narrow cobblestone streets leading from Buchenwald's gates, a column of liberated prisoners moved like ghosts given sudden flesh. Skeletal frames wrapped in striped fabric, eyes hollowed by months of calculated starvation. They shuffled past stone houses with shuttered windows, past gardens where spring flowers had begun their indifferent bloom, past German women who stood in doorways with baskets clutched against their chests. The women had heard the artillery for days, felt the tremors through their floors as the Americans approached. They had been told by their men, by the party officials, by the whispered rumors that spread through the town like fever, that the enemy was coming, savage liberators who would burn everything, who would take vengeance without mercy. Some had hidden their daughters. Some had buried their valuables. All had prepared for the worst. But what they witnessed that afternoon shattered every expectation. Their ideology had built American. Officers walked among the prisoners not with the rigid formality of conquerors, not with the cold efficiency of executioners, but with something the women of Weimar had no framework to understand. The officers laughed, not cruel laughter, not mockery, but genuine warmth. They shared cigarettes with men who could barely stand. They removed their own jackets to drape over trembling shoulders. One young lieutenant, no more than 23 years old, knelt in the mud to help an elderly Polish man tie his shoe, speaking to him in broken German with a smile that held no hatred, only concern. The women stared. Some covered their mouths. Others simply stood frozen, their faces registering a horror that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with the collapse of their understanding of the world. This was not how victors were supposed to behave. This was not how power was supposed to operate. This was not what they had been promised about the nature of strength. To understand the magnitude of what those women witnessed, one must first understand what they had been taught to expect. The architecture of Nazi ideology rested on a foundation of hierarchical brutality, a worldview in which power expressed itself through domination, where strength manifested as cruelty, where the relationship between victor and vanquished was defined by humiliation and fear. For 12 years, the German people had been immersed in a cultural framework that equated compassion with weakness, that viewed mercy as a failure of will. The SS guards at Buchenwald had operated according to these principles with methodical precision. Prisoners were not individuals but units of labor to be extracted, discarded, and replaced. The distance between guard and prisoner was maintained through systematic dehumanization. Beatings administered not in anger but as routine. Starvation implemented not as punishment but as policy. The women of Weimar had watched these guards walk through their town with polished boots and iron composure, had seen them in the cafes and shops, had absorbed through cultural osmosis the understanding that this was what authority looked like. Many of these women had husbands, brothers, sons serving in the Wehrmacht. Letters from the Eastern Front had described a different kind of warfare than what their fathers had known in the previous war, a conflict stripped of chivalric pretension, where Soviet prisoners were left to starve in open pens, where entire villages disappeared in the wake of advancing columns. The letters spoke of necessity, of hardness, of doing what survival demanded. The women had learned not to question too deeply, had learned to find comfort in the certainty that their men were strong. That strength meant doing the difficult things without flinching. Then came the Americans, and with them came a confusion that ideology could not explain away. The U.S. Third Army under General George S. Patton had liberated Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, though elements of the 6th Armored Division had arrived to find the prisoners had already risen up against the remaining guards. What followed in the subsequent days was not the vengeful rampage that Goebbels' propaganda had promised would come with Allied victory. Instead, it was something far more unsettling to the local population. It was organization, efficiency, and an almost incomprehensible gentleness toward those who had been imprisoned. Medical units arrived within hours. Field kitchens were established. Army doctors moved through the barracks with urgent care, rationing food carefully to men whose bodies could not yet process normal meals. Chaplains of multiple faiths offered prayers and comfort. Soldiers who days before had been fighting through German defenses now cradled dying men, writing down their final words to send to families they would never see again. The German women watched this through windows, from street corners behind half-closed doors. They had expected retribution. They had prepared for violence. What they received instead was a demonstration that dismantled the entire moral architecture of everything they had been taught. Corporal James T. Murphy from Cleveland, Ohio, had been among the first American soldiers to enter Buchenwald's main compound. He was 24 years old, the son of Irish immigrants, raised Catholic in a working-class neighborhood where his father had worked at a steel mill and his mother had taken in laundry to help make ends meet. He had never seen anything like the camps, had never imagined that human beings could do such things to one another with such systematic thoroughness. In his diary, recovered years later, and now housed in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Murphy wrote, "We were told to be professional, to document everything, to not let our emotions take over. But how do you stay professional when you're looking at walking skeletons who grab your hand and kiss it just because you gave them water? How do you not cry when a man who weighs maybe 70 pounds uses his last strength to smile at you and say, 'Thank you,' in broken English?" Murphy and thousands of soldiers like him had been raised in a culture vastly different from what had taken root in Germany. American ideology, for all its contradictions and failures, was built on a different foundation, one that emphasized individual dignity, that celebrated abundance rather than scarcity, that viewed generosity as strength rather than weakness. They came from a nation that had never known occupation, that had not experienced the trauma of the Treaty of Versailles, that had not endured the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic, or the political chaos that had birthed fascism. They brought with them chocolate bars and cigarettes, not as tools of manipulation but as simple gestures of humanity. They brought laughter, the easy, unguarded laughter of young men who had been taught that kindness was not something to be rationed, that dignity was not a zero-sum game where one person's worth required another's degradation. The women of Weimar had no category for this. In their framework, the Americans should have been either weaklings easily crushed by German military might, or they should have been brutal conquerors taking vengeance. But these soldiers were neither. They had crushed the Wehrmacht with overwhelming force, had demonstrated military superiority that left no doubt about their strength. Yet here they were, kneeling in the mud to help prisoners who could not help themselves, sharing food from their own rations, treating men the SS had designated as subhuman, with a respect that seemed to come, not from orders but from some internal moral compass the women had been taught did not exist in their enemies. Frau Helene Richter was 38 years old that April, the wife of a Buchenwald administrative clerk who had fled with the retreating SS. She lived in a neat house 3 streets from the main square, with lace curtains and a small garden where she grew vegetables to supplement the increasingly meager rations. She considered herself a good German woman, practical, loyal, not interested in politics. Her husband had said the camp was necessary for security, for protecting the German people from criminals and subversives. She had not asked questions. Questions led nowhere useful. On April 16th, 5 days after liberation, American military authorities ordered the residents of Weimar to tour Buchenwald. This was not a request. Trucks arrived in the town square. Officers with megaphones announced in careful German that all residents between the ages of 18 and 60 would be transported to see what had been operating on their doorstep. Some protested. Many wept. All went. Helene Richter walked through the gates of Buchenwald and saw the bodies stacked like cordwood, saw the crematorium ovens, saw the medical experimentation facilities, saw the survivors who could barely lift their heads. An American major, she never learned his name, walked beside her group, not speaking with anger but with a terrible, controlled clarity. He pointed to the warehouses filled with prisoners' belongings, to the systematic records the Germans had kept with such meticulous care, to the evidence that left no room for denial. What broke something in Helene's mind was not the horror itself. The mind can protect itself from horror through numbness, through shock, through retreat into incomprehension. What shattered her carefully constructed worldview was the behavior of the American soldiers moving through that landscape of calculated death. They treated the German civilians with stern formality. Yes, they made them look, made them witness. But even in that moment of forced confrontation, the Americans did not become the monsters Nazi propaganda had promised. They did not beat the German civilians. They did not humiliate them. They simply made them see. And in the background, visible through the barracks windows, Helene could see American medics working with desperate urgency to save prisoners who, days before, had been designated for extermination. She saw an American chaplain holding the hand of a dying Jewish man, praying with him in Hebrew despite not being Jewish himself, had learned the words, someone said, so he could offer comfort in a language the dying man would understand. She saw soldiers weeping openly at what they were witnessing, not ashamed of their tears, not performing toughness or stoicism, but simply allowing themselves to feel the weight of what they had uncovered. This was the horror that paralyzed Helene Richter and women like her, the realization that everything they had been taught about strength and weakness was backwards. The Americans were not weak for showing compassion. They were terrifying in their strength specifically because compassion did not diminish them. They could afford gentleness because their power was so overwhelming, so total, that they had no need to perform cruelty to maintain it. The cigarette became the symbol that captured this collision of worldviews. Throughout the liberation of concentration camps across Germany and Austria, from Dachau to Mauthausen to Nordhausen, American soldiers distributed cigarettes with a casualness that seemed almost obscene to German observers. In a society where every resource had been carefully rationed, where even the most basic goods had become instruments of control and power, the Americans' abundance appeared almost supernatural. The cigarette was not just tobacco and paper, it was a physical manifestation of ideological difference. In the Nazi state, cigarettes had been tools of hierarchy. They were distributed according to status, used as rewards for compliance, withheld as punishment. The distance between the person who gave and the person who received was always clear, always reinforcing the structure of domination. But American soldiers handed out cigarettes the way they handed out smiles, freely, without calculation, without requiring anything in return. To prisoners who had forgotten what it meant to receive something without strings attached, this simple gesture carried weight beyond the commodity itself. It was a cigarette offered not from superior to inferior, but from one human being to another. It was given with the assumption that the person receiving it had inherent dignity, regardless of their current condition. German women watching these exchanges saw the cigarette change meaning before their eyes. An SS guard would have used it to extract obedience, to create dependence, to remind the prisoner of their powerlessness. The American soldier offered it with a laugh, maybe a pat on the shoulder, maybe a few words in broken German or Polish or Yiddish, and then moved on without expecting gratitude or submission. The transaction completed itself without establishing hierarchy. This was abundance operating according to different rules. The Americans came from a nation that had not known real deprivation during the war years. Had known rationing, yes, but nothing like the starvation that had gripped Europe. They came from a place where generosity was not a threat to survival, but an expression of strength. They had so much that they could afford to give without calculation. Records from the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps show the scale of this abundance. In the weeks following the liberation of major concentration camps, American forces distributed over 15 million cigarettes to survivors and displaced persons. They established field kitchens that served meals to thousands daily. They requisitioned buildings from German civilians to create hospitals and recovery centers. They brought in supplies not just from military stocks, but from care packages sent by American civilians who had heard about the camps and wanted to help. The women of Weimar and Dachau and Nordhausen and countless other towns saw these supplies arrive and could not square it with what they had been promised about their enemies. These were supposed to be the plutocratic Americans, soft and decadent, crushed under the weight of their own materialism. Instead, their material abundance seemed to enable rather than corrupt them. They had so much that they could afford principles. They had so much that compassion was not a luxury they couldn't afford, but a natural expression of their values. Lieutenant Sarah Morgenstern, one of the few female officers working with the Allied military government in the immediate aftermath of liberation, kept detailed notes of her interactions with German civilians. The daughter of Jewish immigrants who had fled pogroms in Eastern Europe a generation earlier, Morgenstern had volunteered for military service immediately after Pearl Harbor. She spoke fluent German and Yiddish, and her role involved coordinating between military authorities and civilian populations. In her letters home to her family in Brooklyn, she described a conversation with a German woman in her 50s, the widow of a Wehrmacht officer killed in France. The woman had been ordered to help sort through confiscated German civilian goods being redistributed to displaced persons. While folding clothes, she suddenly looked at Morgenstern and asked, "Why are you not angry with us?" Morgenstern wrote, "I didn't know how to answer at first. Of course I'm angry. Of course I'm devastated by what we found." But she wasn't asking about my personal feelings. She was asking about the policy, about the institutional approach. She had expected camps for German civilians, expected mass executions, expected the kind of collective punishment that her own government had implemented everywhere it conquered. Instead, we were feeding German children, re-establishing water systems, creating civilian administrations. She couldn't understand it. She said, "In your place, we would have—" And then she stopped, because she realized what she was saying. That was the moment. That's when I saw it break through her indoctrination. Not because I lectured her, not because we punished her, but because our restraint was more terrifying to her worldview than our vengeance would have been. This restraint was not accidental. It was embedded in the training American soldiers received, in the cultural values they brought with them, in the institutional frameworks the Allies established for occupation. The contrast with Nazi occupation policy could not have been more stark. Where German forces had immediately established regimes of terror in occupied territories, mass hostage-taking, collective punishment, systematic starvation, American occupation authorities focused on rebuilding infrastructure, establishing rule of law, and creating systems of accountability through trials rather than summary justice. For German women who had internalized Nazi ideology, this approach created profound cognitive dissonance. They had been taught that all international relations were fundamentally struggles for dominance, that mercy was merely weakness wearing a mask, that any victor would naturally impose maximum suffering on the defeated because that was simply the nature of power. The Americans violated every assumption by demonstrating that strength could coexist with principle, that victory did not require cruelty, that abundance could generate generosity rather than hoarding. The laughter was perhaps the most unsettling element. In the concentration camp system, laughter had existed only as mockery, the guards' cruel amusement at prisoners' suffering, the dark humor that dehumanization bred. It was a tool of psychological domination, a way of emphasizing powerlessness. The prisoner was not just starved and beaten, they were also made into a joke, stripped of dignity through ridicule. American soldiers laughed differently. They laughed with the prisoners, not at them. They told jokes to men recovering in field hospitals, teaching them American slang and colloquialisms. They played cards with recovering prisoners, organizing informal games where the American soldiers sometimes deliberately lost, just to give the men the pleasure of winning something. They sang songs, encouraged survivors to sing their own songs, created moments of levity that had no purpose except to remind everyone involved that they were human beings capable of joy. German women observed these interactions with a kind of scandalized fascination. How could these soldiers be so informal? Where was the rigid hierarchy they had been taught was essential to military discipline? How could these men who had just fought through the most brutal warfare the world had ever seen transition so easily to gentleness? Where was the hardness, the cruelty, the necessary brutality that war supposedly required? The answer lay in a fundamental difference in how power was understood. Nazi ideology conceived of power as necessarily zero-sum. For one person to have dignity, another must be degraded. For one nation to prosper, others must be subjugated. The hierarchy must be maintained through constant reinforcement of domination. Compassion represented a loss of position, a weakening of the distance between superior and inferior. American ideology, whatever its hypocrisies and failures in practice, operated according to different theoretical principles. Power could be generative rather than extractive. Dignity was not a finite resource but something that could be shared without diminishment. Strength manifested not in the ability to inflict suffering, but in the capacity to restrain that impulse, to operate according to principle even when brute force was available. The laughter embodied this difference. American soldiers could afford to laugh, could afford to treat prisoners as individuals worthy of casual friendship, because their sense of themselves was not dependent on maintaining psychological distance through cruelty. They had been raised in a culture that valued informality, that was suspicious of rigid hierarchy, that saw friendliness as strength rather than weakness. Records from the International Red Cross and various military chaplaincy services document thousands of small moments that captured this dynamic. An American private teaching a Polish prisoner to play baseball with a stick and a rolled-up sock. A group of soldiers organizing a makeshift birthday party for a French political prisoner who mentioned it was his 50th birthday. An army cook who spent his off hours teaching survivors how to make American-style pancakes, believing that learning to cook something new would help them reclaim agency. These were not official programs. They were not ordered from above. They emerged organically from soldiers who had been raised in communities where neighborliness was a virtue, where helping someone who needed help was simply what decent people did, where the default mode of interaction was friendly rather than formal. Frau Anna Weber was 26 years old, a committed member of the Bund Deutscher Mädel before the war, married to an SS officer who had served at Auschwitz before being transferred to Berlin. She had believed deeply in the cause, had organized youth programs teaching racial purity, had been certain of German superiority and destiny. When the Americans arrived, she had hidden in her cellar with her 2 young children, convinced they would be raped and murdered. Instead, an American patrol knocked on her door 3 days after the fall of Berlin and asked if she had food and clean water. The soldier was black, something her ideology had taught her to view as subhuman, as evidence of American degeneracy. But he spoke to her with polite formality, asked about her children's health, gave her chocolate bars for them, and moved on. He did not touch her. He did not threaten. He simply performed a welfare check and left. Anna Weber's world collapsed in that moment more completely than any bombing raid could have achieved. The cognitive dissonance was total. This soldier, whom she had been taught to see as racially inferior, had treated her with more dignity and respect than she had shown to the people she had been taught were threats to civilization. He had power over her, absolute power, and had chosen gentleness, not weakness, because his uniform and weapon made clear he had the force to do whatever he wanted. But gentleness as a choice, as an expression of values she had been taught, did not exist. This experience was replicated millions of times across occupied Germany. African American soldiers whom Nazi propaganda had depicted as subhuman brutes were distributing food and medicine. Jewish American soldiers, whom the Reich had designated for extermination, were helping German civilians fill out forms to receive aid. Japanese American soldiers from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, whose own families had been interned by the U.S. government, were treating German prisoners with careful correctness. The contradictions piled upon contradictions until ideology could no longer contain them. If the Americans were weak, how had they won? If they were savage, why the restraint? If their democracy was decadent, how had it generated such overwhelming industrial and military power? If their racial mixing was degrading, why were their mixed-race units so effective? Every foundational assumption of Nazi thought ran headlong into observable reality and shattered. The transformation in German civilian consciousness did not happen instantly. Ideology is resilient, and the human mind is adept at protecting itself from information that threatens its fundamental framework. Many Germans retreated into denial, claiming they had not known about the camps, had not understood what was happening, had been deceived by their leaders. Others doubled down, insisting that despite defeat, the underlying principles had been correct, even if the implementation had failed. But for some, and Helene Richter, and Anna Weber and thousands of women like them, the contrast between expectation and reality opened cracks that could not be sealed. They had expected monsters and received human beings. They had expected vengeance and received principles. They had expected brutality and received a demonstration that power and compassion were not mutually exclusive. The cigarette offered with a smile. The laughter shared over a card game. The soldier who gave up his jacket. The medic who wept. These small moments accumulated into a massive, ideological weight that 12 years of propaganda could not bear. Psychological studies conducted in the decades after the war examined this phenomenon. How direct contradiction of ideological prediction through lived experience could penetrate indoctrination in ways that argument and evidence alone could not. When Nazi propaganda promised that Americans would behave one way, and then Americans behaved in precisely the opposite manner, the dissonance created an opening for questioning that had not existed before. The women who stared in horror were experiencing the collapse of their worldview in real time. Horror not at violence, but at the absence of expected violence. Horror not at cruelty, but at unexpected gentleness. Horror at the realization that they had built their understanding of the world on foundations that were not just morally wrong, but factually incorrect about how power could operate. By the summer of 1945, as the full scale of the Holocaust became undeniable and the Nuremberg trials began organizing evidence of systematic atrocity, the contrast in behavior between occupiers took on additional dimensions. Soviet forces in the East, operating according to their own ideology of class struggle and revenge for Nazi atrocities in the USSR, implemented a harsh occupation characterized by mass rape, deportation, and summary justice. German civilians in the Soviet zone experienced exactly the kind of retribution they had feared. But in the American, British, and French zones, despite the horrors uncovered and the justified fury those horrors generated, the occupation remained relatively restrained. War crimes were prosecuted through formal tribunals. German civilians received food aid. Children were not punished for their parents' crimes. Infrastructure was rebuilt. Democracy was imposed not through terror, but through patient institution building. This difference was not lost on German civilians. Women who had fled westward from the Soviet advance, who had heard stories of what was happening in the East, found themselves in American-occupied zones where the worst did not come to pass. The comparison was stark and unavoidable. Both occupiers had legitimate grievances. Both had suffered enormously at German hands. But their responses differed in ways that reflected fundamentally different ideologies about human nature, power, and the relationship between victor and vanquished, Lieutenant Morgenstern wrote in July 1945. Today, a German woman asked me why we feed German children when German policies starved millions. It's the question that haunts all of us who work in civilian affairs. My answer was simple: because they're children, and it's not their fault. She looked at me like I had spoken in a foreign language. In a way, I had. The concept that collective punishment is wrong, that individual guilt must be established, that children are not responsible for their parents' crimes, these are foreign concepts to a society that operated according to racial collective guilt for 12 years. We're not just occupying territory. We're trying to occupy minds that have been taught to think in categories we consider morally absurd. The epilogue to this collision of worldviews played out over decades. The women of Weimar and Dachau and thousands of other towns went on with their lives. They rebuilt homes, raised children, buried their Nazi past under a combination of silence and selective memory. West Germany integrated into the Western Alliance, built a thriving democracy, confronted its history with varying degrees of honesty across generations. But those moments of initial contact, when American soldiers first walked through liberated camps laughing with prisoners, when black soldiers treated white German civilians with respect, when overwhelming military superiority coexisted with institutional restraint, those moments left marks on individual consciousness that never fully faded. Frau Helene Richter lived until 1983. Her daughter found, after her death, a small collection of items hidden in a box in the attic. Among them was a single American cigarette, never smoked, wrapped carefully in paper. On the paper, in Helene's handwriting, Buchenwald, April 1945. Given to me by a soldier after I saw. I couldn't smoke it. Needed to keep it. To remember that I was wrong. Anna Weber became, in the 1960s, a teacher who specialized in Holocaust education. She never fully shed her past. Could not, should not, but spent decades ensuring that German children understood what had been done in their grandparents' names. In an interview in 1978, she said, "The worst moment of my life was not when we lost the war. It was when an American Negro soldier gave my children chocolate, and I realized that everything I had believed about superiority and inferiority was a lie. That was the moment I died and had to learn how to be human again." The horror those women experienced was not the horror of atrocity witnessed, though many witnessed atrocity directly. It was the horror of foundational belief collapsing. They had bet their moral universe on certain truths about power, about race, about the nature of strength and weakness. And in the space of days, sometimes hours, those truths revealed themselves as lies. The Americans, for their part, were not saints. Their own nation's racial crimes, its treatment of indigenous peoples, its history of slavery, its ongoing segregation, these contradictions traveled with them. Many African American soldiers who treated German civilians with dignity returned home to a Jim Crow South that denied them basic rights. Japanese American soldiers who exemplified courage returned to find their families' property seized, their loyalty questioned. The American abundance that seemed so limitless in occupied Germany coexisted with poverty and injustice at home. But in that specific moment, in those specific encounters between liberators and the people who lived adjacent to horror, the Americans embodied an ideology that operated according to different rules than what the Nazi state had built. Not perfect rules, not consistently applied rules, but different rules nonetheless. Rules that suggested power could be restrained, that abundance could generate generosity, that strength did not require cruelty to prove itself. The laughter of American officers with liberated prisoners, the casual sharing of cigarettes, the informal friendliness that seemed so incomprehensible to German observers. These were not acts of naivete or weakness. They were expressions of an ideology that conceived of human dignity as non-zero sum, that valued individual worth over hierarchical domination, that understood power as something more than the ability to inflict suffering. The women who stared in horror were watching their world end, not the physical world that had already been destroyed by bombs and armies, but the ideological world, the framework of meaning that had organized their understanding of how power operated, how strength manifested, how victors were supposed to behave. That world collapsed in the gap between expectation and reality, between what they had been promised about their enemies and what those enemies actually did when they had every justification for vengeance, but chose principle instead. In the end, the horror was education. Brutal education, devastating education, but education nonetheless. The lesson written not in words but in gestures, in jackets given to shivering prisoners, in chocolate shared with starving men, in laughter that acknowledged shared humanity across the chasm of unthinkable suffering. The lesson that power could choose restraint, that abundance could enable rather than corrupt, that the relationship between strong and weak did not have to be written in humiliation and fear. The cigarette, passed from hand to hand, became something more than tobacco. It became a symbol of ideological difference made tangible, not because the Americans were morally perfect, but because in that moment they demonstrated that another way was possible. That democracy, whatever its failures, could generate soldiers who treated prisoners as human beings worthy of dignity. That abundance, whatever its origins, could manifest as generosity rather than hoarding. That victory did not require cruelty to prove itself. The women of Weimar and Dachau and countless other towns carried that knowledge forward, whether they acknowledged it or not. They had stared into the face of their own ideology's collapse and seen, in the gap where certainty used to be, the terrible possibility that they had been wrong about everything, that the people they had been taught to despise as weak were actually strong enough to be gentle, that the enemies they had been promised would destroy them were instead rebuilding their nation, that the monsters of propaganda were, in fact, young men from Cleveland and Brooklyn and Alabama who laughed easily, shared freely, and treated even former enemies as human beings deserving of basic decency. That was the horror. That was the transformation. And that was the lesson that American abundance and democratic values taught without speaking. That power is not proven through domination, that strength does not require cruelty, and that the laughter of free men is not a sign of weakness, but the sound of an ideology that could afford to be generous because it was built on foundations vast enough to include even those who had been enemies. The cigarette offered with a smile, the jacket draped over shivering shoulders, the laughter shared across the ruins of the worst that humanity could do. These were the weapons that won the peace, the tools that demonstrated what victory could look like when it was guided by principles that valued life over death, connection over domination, abundance over scarcity. And the women who witnessed it stared in horror, not at what the Americans did, but at what their horror revealed about everything they had believed and the lies on which they had built their world.